Everybody, welcome back to the Dynasty Slant, PFF's fantasy podcast that's centered on Dynasty and Keeper Leagues. I'm Scott Spratt, and I'm joined, as always, by co-host Michael Moore. And Michael, since the last time we talked 2 weeks ago, your new boy Jimmy Garoppolo signed a multi-year contract worth $74.1 million in guarantees. What's the state of Niners Nation, and what should he spend his money on?
Well, the state of Niners Nation, Scott, is it's Super Bowl or bust at this point. And in fact, I'll be going to Las Vegas myself next weekend to do that very thing and place that bet. So if anyone else wants to put bets on that and I can be your mule, just let me know.
Smart. You should probably go ahead and book your ticket to Canton, too. I don't know if that's going to be like 2040 or when exactly that'll be.
Well, yeah, I've got time for that. Now, I don't know.
Yeah.
I forgot where the Super Bowl is next year, but I probably should start looking at flights and hotels and all that like now. As far as what he will spend his money on, I mean, I don't know. He looks pretty good in his current wardrobe and with his current style, Scott. So I don't know if he needs to do a whole lot different. Just more of the same, right? Just keep it up. Just keep the appearance up, and we're good to go.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started with the actual show.
Oh my God! It's picked off.
Topic 6.
All right, Michael, to get things kicked off with our first topic, let's talk about Bengals backup quarterback A.J. McCarron, who had filed a grievance with the NFL and won it to become an unrestricted free agent. So this kind of has some background that I'm going to explain here. So, Michael, you can kick back for like 2 minutes while I kind of run through this situation.
Okay.
But this whole thing stems from McCarron's rookie season, when the Bengals kept him on the non-football injury list until December. And because of that, that held him under 6 games, and you need at least 6 games in a season for the season to accrue as service time, quote unquote. So rookies need to accrue 4 total years of service time to become unrestricted free agents. This is very similar to in Major League Baseball, when teams will hold prospects down in the minors for the first few weeks of a season, or sometimes until after what's called the Super 2 deadline, and that gives the team an extra year of team control. Something very similar to that happens in the NFL, where if you don't accrue a full year of service, a player becomes a restricted free agent, and the team has more ability to keep that player, even if the player would prefer to leave. So this is kind of the crazy thing that's been happening with McCarron. The reason that I'm kind of explaining this in detail is because it gets really, really funny. You may remember this whole situation coming up because McCarron was almost dealt to the Browns at the trade deadline, but the team failed to get their trade papers in by the deadline. They were a few minutes late, and the league office rejected the trade from happening because of that. So the reason this is really funny is because at the time, the Browns were going to trade their 2nd and 3rd round picks this year for McCarron. That's more than your 49ers gave up for Jimmy Garoppolo, just a 2nd round pick. And the reason that the Browns presumably thought that McCarron was worth more money was because they thought that he was going to be a restricted free agent, which would have given them a year and a half of team control, not just a half year the 49ers got for Garoppolo. So the thing that would have been hilarious about this is if the Browns had actually filed that paper on time and gotten McCarron would have been ruled an unrestricted free agent. All of a sudden, McCarron's free agency timetable would have been the same as Garoppolo's, and they would be getting absolutely eviscerated today for having paid more money for McCarron than Garoppolo with the same number of games of team control. So I think that long story is to say that the Browns really dodged a bullet by failing to get those trade papers in time. And their first ineptitude actually made their second ineptitude, which would have been way worse, not come into effect.
Right. So really, their ineptness has come full circle.
Yeah, I mean, it really worked out for them. So today, the Browns are really the big winner, in addition to A.J. McCarron himself, who can now sign with whatever team he wants to and presumably get a starting position or a starting job. But now that I'm talking about that, let's actually talk about the fantasy impact of this, Michael, finally. So where do you think of McCarron as a player, and what do you think he fits in your dynasty quarterback rankings now that he can potentially land a starting job as soon as the season?
Well, I don't put a lot of value on him as a standalone as far as dynasty value goes. I mean, I would probably put him in the mid-20s, maybe late 20s, strictly because he should be, like you said, getting a starting job this year. So he'll have some value from that standpoint. Now, do I think he's a long-term asset? Not really. I mean, and I know, you've looked at the stats. His stats are fairly pedestrian as far as his limited sample size that we have. It kind of reminds me, quite honestly, of the John Gruden effect, and here's what I mean by that. So You had A.J. McCarron, who did stand in for Andy Dalton in 2015 for about a month. He started 4 games. He threw 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He averaged a little under 200 yards per outing. But that was literally over 2 years ago. He's had limited playing time since then. And I feel like because of the time that's elapsed since then, it's kind of made people think more highly of him than he actually is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And because the level of quarterback play is so bad, at least on the bottom level, that you look at a guy who threw up very, decent stats, and they're very, very average, I would say. And people think oh, that's starting caliber level, when in reality, I think teams should be shooting for higher. So, like I said, I think he's got some value, but that's only because he will be a starter, not because I think he's actually a good player. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. You're right that his stats aren't exactly noteworthy. He averaged 6.9 yards per attempt in his 133 NFL attempts. 64.7% completion percentage is pretty good. His whole package kind of reminds me of Alex Smith before his 2017 performance boost, except that McCarron doesn't have the same wheels as Smith. So from a fantasy perspective, he's not going to be giving you those rushing yards that have been key to making Smith a quarterback 2 or even borderline quarterback 1 at times. So you're right. I think that the top end of his fantasy potential isn't super high. He's a former 5th-round pick, but he's kind of got some size at 6'3", 220 pounds. Completed the ball well at Alabama and threw for a pretty good 8.8 yards per attempt. So, he wouldn't be the first guy to come out of that type of depth of a draft pick to become a good player. In fact, with the prospect projection system that I'm working on, he looks kind of similar to Kirk Cousins and Jimmy Garoppolo, who had a kind of similar later round pick and then blossomed, obviously. But he also looks like guys like Brandon Weeden and Connor Cook and Garrett Grayson that never really became anything. So I think there's enough of a reason to be optimistic, and it's enough that a team should give him a chance. But whether or not that's going to work out, I don't know. It may be kind of a Mike Glennon situation where a team brings him in and then sees how it goes over the first 6 to 8 weeks, and if it doesn't go great, they can move on with whatever rookie quarterback they have on their team.
Yeah, I think that would be a win-win for everybody, quite honestly, because you've got McCarron, who could get a pretty good signing bonus for very, very limited actual game action. But a team that is needing a quarterback, especially one towards the top of the draft, whether that's the Browns, whether that's the Jets, maybe, whether that's the Broncos, can bring in McCarron as sort of their safety valve, or even just that bridge, and whatever it is, whether it's half the season, the full season, whatever. I don't think a team would begrudge McCarron if he played decent enough to keep a rookie on the bench the whole year. I think they would prefer that. So, yeah, I agree with you. I don't see him landing somewhere and being that long-term solution. That would stun me.
Okay, next up, I think maybe a day or two after we recorded our previous podcast, the whole Josh McDaniels saga unfolded. And so, as a reminder, McDaniels backed out of a presumed done deal to become the Colts' new head coach. And since then, Eagles offensive coordinator Frank Reich has taken the job with the Colts. So, Michael, given that we thought it was going to be McDaniels and now it's Reich, are there any Colts players that you expect will be particularly benefit or suffer because of that sort of bait and switch situation that happened?
Well, and I know you've got some interesting stats on the run game, and look, I think whoever the running back is there will benefit, and we'll get to that in a second. But what I noticed about the Eagles, especially during Frank Reich's time there wasn't a, I guess, dominant receiver that hogged a lot of targets. Right? There wasn't a guy that got 150 or 180 targets or some crazy number. It was pretty well balanced. Don't get me wrong. They had Alshon Jeffrey, who was the top receiver. But again, it's not like he saw an inordinate amount of targets go his way. So I say all that to say that, T.Y. Hilton's a very good player. I'm still going to draft him very high, but I don't know that he's going to be the target hog that he's been accustomed to being in Indianapolis. I think if they bring in other receivers, which they're due to do, whether it's in the draft or free agency, and whether that's, I don't know that they bring back Dante Moncrief. I don't know if they, keep some of the guys that they have on there currently. But whoever they do bring in behind Hilton, I think will have some value there. I just do. So, but you've got some numbers on the running game, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I could see that. I could see Hilton's sort of target share decrease a little bit, especially if the Colts can do as good a job as the Eagles at bringing in quality depth at skill position players. But the one thing that I'll say that I think may counterbalance that is that under Reich, the Eagles played at really good tempo. They actually ran the most plays over the last 2 seasons in all of NFL, and it was about 20 plays more than the Patriots ran in 4th place. So it goes the Eagles, Ravens, Jaguars, Patriots, and Saints. So I think that it's kind of good news. It's not necessarily that different than what McDaniels would have done himself, but it's better than what the Colts have been doing. So like even if Hilton's share of targets decreases slightly, I feel like the overall number of targets should increase because the Colts are going to play a little bit faster tempo than they previously have.
That's true. I mean, like, for example, the top 3 targets last year for the Eagles were Alshon at 120, and then Zach Ertz actually at 110, and then Nelson Aguilar at 95. So, yeah, I could see that. I think, yeah, what you're saying is the pie is going to get bigger there anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm leaning at this point. What you were saying about the running game that I was looking into a little bit was that Reich has had an offense that's skewed a little bit more towards the run than I guess a typical team would be, whereas the Pats have obviously skewed very heavily toward the pass in recent seasons, obviously. But even with Wentz breaking out in 2017, the Eagles skewed much more heavily toward the run than you would expect. I think they were maybe top 10 in run ratio. So I'm wondering if maybe the running backs overall with the Colts will see a relative benefit versus if they had McDaniels. My question for you, Michael, is really I just don't know who that's going to be. I mean, Frank Gore is an unrestricted free agent. I'm not sure the Colts are going to bring him back, especially at his age. Marlon Mack is there in his 2nd year. He's probably the most exciting internal option they have, but he's a former 4th-round pick out of USF. I'm not really sure what kind of player he is. And then they have the high draft pick. Like, Michael, where do you see the Colts going at the position?
Well, it's kind of funny. Of all the years that the Colts could take an offensive player high in the draft when they don't need to, this would be the perfect year, right? Because you've got Barkley there who has a good chance of being there at 4. But they just have so many other needs that, especially on defense, that I think they go that route in the draft. So, but there's a lot of options, whether it's free agency or even later in the draft too. I mean, there's just a ton of very good running backs in this class that they can get in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round. And I think kind of like we talked about last time, I should say, you've got a lot of teams that are going to be looking at the Saints and what they did with Kamara in the 2nd, or Kareem Hunt, and when the Chiefs drafted him in the 4th, and saying to themselves, hey, we don't need to draft a running back in the 1st round. We can wait in that 2nd to 4th round range and still get a quality back. So between that and free agency, I think they probably go that route. So, look, would Carlos Hyde do pretty well there? I think so. Would one of the running backs drafted later in the draft do well there also? I think so. So, yeah, it's pretty wide open as far as who exactly is going to fill that spot. But don't sleep on Frank Gore, Scott. Like, people need to stop doubting Frank Gore until they carry that guy off the field. Like, I'm not going to think he can't get 1,000 yards.
No, I mean, I love Gore as much as probably most 49ers fans.
Like, don't let him hear that you doubted him, Scott. Like, he will, don't do it.
The thing that's always impressed me about Gore is like how frequently he faces heavy boxes and has still been like a 4+ yards per carry machine in his career. So like, I love him, but like there would be some poetry if the team went with Saquon Barkley. It would be very similar to when Peyton Manning had Edgerrin James. And it's kind of like, if you have your offensive strength around luck, maybe you should just keep building offense. And that's kind of that worked. That formula worked for the Colts previously. I guess it's just a question of how good do teams think Barkley is. Is he more than just a typical first-round type of talent? Is he maybe the best player in the draft, period?
Right.
And maybe that becomes worth it then. Who knows? We'll just have to see.
Well, and just one last note on that. I'm going to be drafting Jack Doyle pretty high, I think, in all my drafts. So
I think I got Doyle in the mock draft. We're going to bring that up a little bit later in the show. Not him specifically, but he was my second tight end in the fantasy mock draft that we did recently. All right, next topic. The franchise tag decisions are coming up. They're going to be due by March the 6th. So I thought it would be fun if we went through some of the possible candidates among fantasy relevant players of guys that could get the tag. And then I want to get your thoughts, Michael, on whether or not you think they will get the tag and whether you think they'll be better off with it or without it from a fantasy perspective. You understand the rules?
I think so. Well, let's find out.
Okay, good. Let's start with the Dolphins then, who have potentially Jarvis Landry they could tag for $16.2 million. What do you think?
Oh, man. I mean, I don't have any doubt that he's their best receiver. I just doubt that they want to pay that much for a receiver right after they re-signed Kenny Stills last year for a ton of money. And it would actually cost them more money to cut Stills, hypothetically. So I personally don't think he gets the tag.
Yeah, and I don't really think he'll be as good anywhere else, if only because Landry's averaged 9.1 targets per game over the last 3 years, which is 10th in football. It's just going to be tough for him to get that volume wherever he goes.
Well, and if he does leave at long last, the Devontae Parker truthers will finally have their time to shine. So I can't wait for it.
Shine or not, whichever
Right.
the case may be. Next up, we have the Patriots. This one may be a stretch, but Dion Lewis could get tagged for you're out.
No. There's no way they spend that much on a running back, Scott. None.
Okay, I still think you're underrating how good of a player Lewis is.
And I'm not. No, and that's not to take anything away from him. I agree with you. I think he's a great back. He's probably a top 10 running back in the league, but it would just be mind-boggling for the Patriots to spend that money on one player, let alone a running back. I just can't see it.
So I don't think this is a philosophical question. I think that if Lewis hadn't had his extensive injury history, then there would be no like Patriots philosophy issue with tagging him. It's just that injury history does exist. So I think if they decide to keep him, they're going to probably do it with a contract rather than with a salary, with a franchise tag.
And look, I think they would consider that by all means. I don't necessarily buy that they're just going to show him the door just because he's a running back due for a raise. That franchise tag, man, he would literally have the second highest cap number if he was tagged behind Tom Brady. That would be crazy to me.
And I will remind everyone, I've mentioned these stats like a billion times, but he had 20.2 avoided tackles per 100 carries last year. That was top 5 in football, just between Kareem Hunt and Alvin Kamara. My point is, I think Lewis is going to be a fantasy star no matter where he plays.
And I agree. I took him in our mock draft. So there you go.
I approve. All right. Steelers, they have Le'Veon Bell coming up. They could tag him for $14.5 million. What are your thoughts?
I think it would be, honestly, a really good move for them. I mean, financially, but, he's made those threats about not coming back or not signing it. So I think it would be counterproductive for them to do that again. So I don't think they do that. I do think they work out a deal with him.
Okay, so you expect him to stay with
Correct.
the team. I think fantasy owners should want him to stay just because his usage rate has been so high with the Steelers. Obviously, that's because of Bell's talent to a certain extent, but it seems really difficult for another team to use him to that extent, especially if he's working on a multi-year deal where they need him healthy for the entire length. So hopefully he'll stay with the team. All right, the Jaguars have Allen Robinson, who they could tag for, I think, $16.2 million.
I think they tag him. I don't know that, first of all, they've got any other free agents that they would want to tag. And look, it's the perfect scenario for essentially a 1-year deal, meaning he's coming back from injury. This is kind of the 1-year prove-it deal to make sure his knee and his ACL is fully restored. So I personally think they tag him.
Yeah, I would like to have Robinson on a 1-year deal just because of the uncertainty I have about him as a player. Obviously, the injury being one, but two, in 2016, he was the least efficient wide receiver in football, at least by my yards added metric at negative 94 yards. Basically twice as bad as Michael Floyd and Tavon Austin. So, I have major concerns about Robinson as a player and wouldn't want to give him a multi-year deal. So, if I'm being honest, I would think the Jags would be best served to not tag him and just not retain him at all. Give Keelan Cole that opportunity to fill that role. But if you're going to keep him, I would want it to be on a 1-year deal. So I guess I could kind of see it.
And to your point, though, I mean, they literally went the furthest they've gone in the playoffs without him. He played, I think, 1 snap or saw 1 target, and they played well without him the entire season. So they've got a justification if they do decide, hey, we don't want to do this or we don't want to spend that much or whatever. Well, they can just go, look, we made the AFC Championship game without you. We don't need you. So,
yeah, spend on a quarterback upgrade and make everybody happy. All right, this one's a little weird, but okay. The Redskins have Kirk Cousins, who, if they wanted to, they could tag for $34.5 million.
But I have heard some things on the internet, which the internet is never wrong, that
Sounds trustworthy.
Right.
Keep going.
Where they could tag him, but then immediately trade him, meaning they know there's a market for him. And given, would the trade offers not be nearly as high because teams would know that they had to trade him? Maybe, but still, you would be getting, just one first rounder out of it instead of two. I mean, it wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibility for them to do that and immediately ship him. Do I think they will? No, but I think there's a greater than non-zero chance that they do.
Even if they can't get a first-round pick, which I doubt they could because of the salary cap figure, even if they get a third-round pick, that they would get it sooner than if they let him walk in free agency and get a comp pick. So, it would make some sense. But I think from a fantasy perspective, whatever the case is, he's going to be playing somewhere else next year, right?
Yeah, so I think, look, as soon as that Alex Smith deal was done, we knew where that Kirk Cousins was definitely not going back.
And as I mentioned, I think on last podcast, I'm a little bit dubious that he'll have as good of a receiving core wherever he lands. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about his value, but do think Cousins is a good enough player to be a quarterback one going forward. All right, the Vikings have Case Keenum as, I guess, their best option, potentially. I think they could tag him for $23 million.
Was that a question?
Again, I just don't really know what they're going to do at quarterback. I find it very confusing. All three of their guys are unrestricted free agents at the position.
Man, you know what? I think they do tag him, and I think it would be good for his fantasy production, but only because that's a known entity. We know what he can do with that. Going to any other team, it would just be a risk that he couldn't repeat that. I mean, we know it was a perfect storm of things in Minnesota that contributed to him doing well. I would like to keep him there. I don't think his ceiling is much higher than it was in Minnesota. So I think he would best benefit fantasy-wise if he stayed there.
I'm with you, and I think that he'll end up back in Minnesota one way or the other. Not sure if it's the tag or a longer-term contract, but I think it'll happen. Okay, I'll bring up the Saints just because, just from the outside looking in, it might seem like they have a couple of franchise candidates, specifically with Drew Brees. But Brees has in his contract that the team isn't allowed to franchise him, so smart move by Brees there, but they can't tag him. Regardless, I'm sure he'll be back with the team. And this is something that I brought up a few shows ago that I think I should re-mention. Mark Ingram didn't make the All-Pro team, and so his contract clause didn't kick in to give him the option to leave his contract. So that means that Ingram is still with the team and will therefore not be someone that needs to get franchised. So I think the Saints are standing pat with that. Just thought I'd bring it up. Okay, one more franchise candidate, though. We have the Rams with Sammy Watkins. Again, I think this is a $16.2 million potential tag.
You know what? I do think they tag him. I think, it's obviously a short-term risk. They gave up a lot when they traded for him with that second rounder and their cornerback. So I think they do just to give themselves a chance, quite honestly, to see what he can do. Do I think it's good for his fantasy production? No, I don't. I think he's going to have another year similar to what he had this year, which wasn't great. So I think he goes back, but I don't think it is good for anyone.
I agree with you that I think he would be better on another team from a fantasy perspective. But I will say that Watkins showed really good efficiency numbers this year, and I feel like he is the receiver on the Rams that I would most want to own. And I think he may end up being a value in fantasy drafts, but a value in the 8th round or 9th round or whatever, not a guy that you're looking at to be your number 2 wide receiver in fantasy, if that makes sense. Okay, Michael, so similar to what we were just talking about with the franchise tags, you're going to start to see some notable fantasy players getting released in the coming weeks too. So pretty much similar to what we did before, I want you to give me either a yes or a no on whether you think the following players are going to be released. And if the answer is yes, I want you to tell me whether you think they're going to find a job that will let them maintain their current fantasy relevance. We're going to split this into 2 questions. So let's start with the NFC. And the Giants, they have Brandon Marshall, who's going to be 34 in 2018. What do you think for him?
Yeah, I think he'll definitely be cut. He's going to be 34 this season. The Giants have enough, I think, good young receiving weapons between, obviously, Odell Beckham, Sterling Shepard, even Evan Ingram, that they don't necessarily need to have a guy like Brandon Marshall. Now, as to the second part of the question, could he maintain his fantasy relevance? He really hasn't had a truly productive fantasy year since 2015, now that I think about it, with the Jets when he went off for 1,500 yards. So I don't know that he could go anywhere and see the kind of targets he was seeing at those other places.
I don't think he can. Over the last 2 years, he's had negative 68 yards added, which is bottom 10 in the league. I just don't think he's the same player that he was when he's younger. So I think his fantasy relevant days are probably behind him. All right, next up we have the Cowboys, who have Dez Bryant, who's going to be 29 next year. That one's probably a bit more controversial, but what do you think?
Well, I would understand, I guess, somebody who would be in favor of cutting him, but they just don't have that much behind him as far as receivers go. They've got Terrence Williams, who isn't, he's a league replacement level player. They've got Cole Beasley in the slot, who, had a very good 2016, but kind of fell off in 2017. And not much behind that, and look, they still got Jason Witten, or the corpse of Jason Witten, running around. So, I understand people disappointed by Dez's year, and yes, he's expensive, but I don't know what else they would have behind him to justify cutting him.
Yeah, it seems more likely that, if anything, they'll just restructure his contract for a bit of a longer deal, but less of a current cap hit, which would let him stay with the team. But even if Bryant does stay, I will say that I don't think I'm considering him in fantasy drafts before the 4th round. And I don't want to take him over guys like T.Y. Hilton and Stephon Diggs. Even though he's got that touchdown upside, I just think his efficiency numbers are declining in a way that has me a little bit scared.
Well, that, and he's not going to reach the heights that he had during that 3-year stretch when he was averaging like 1,300 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns a game, right? It's just not going to happen again.
Yeah.
So, look, is he still the number one receiver on that team? Yes, but he's just not going to be that wide receiver one that you can rely on.
Okay, next up, the Packers. They have both Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb as potential cuts. Nelson's going to be 33 and Cobb 28 next year.
Yeah, I think they're probably going to cut one of them, only because that would mean if they didn't, they'd have 3 receivers making $10 million or more, which would be, even for a Packers team with Aaron Rodgers, would be a lot of money invested in that position. So having said that, I feel like Jordy is a little closer to being productive again than Randall Cobb. I never understood, quite honestly, the love for Randall Cobb. He did have the one breakout year that, actually was very timely because he got the contract extension. But beyond that, to me, he just hasn't been that special. He had 1 year, it was 2014. He had 91 for 1287 and 12 touchdowns. He hasn't come close to reproducing that at any point. So to me, I would go with Randall Cobb on that. Now, if he could be productive somewhere else, I don't know. If we're saying Jarvis Landry is going to have a hard time finding a home and be productive as a slot guy, I think Randall Cobb would have just as hard a time.
Well, I do think Jarvis is going to be productive. I'm not sure that it's going to be to the top 10 targets in football kind of extent. But speaking of the slot, if they cut Randall Cobb, I wouldn't be shocked if Nelson ended up getting work out of his slot a little bit more. I think that might help counterbalance his declining skill as he gets older. That might be a really nice inside-outside kind of thing going with Devontae Adams. So I think that would make a lot of sense for the team to go with Nelson in the slot if they cut Cobb. Okay, next we have the Buccaneers, who could potentially cut Doug Martin, who will be 28 next year.
Yeah, I would be willing to bet the farm they're gonna cut Doug Martin. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think they surprised a lot of us by not cutting him up to this point, especially after signing him to that pretty big deal. But he just wasn't anything special this year. I mean, hell, he had a 2.9 yards per carry, which actually was the same as his yards per carry last year, which was 2.9. So it's been a good 3 seasons since he's been productive, and with the kind of money he's making and the options that are out there between the draft and free agency, I think it's pretty foregone conclusion they're going to cut him. Now, could he be relevant somewhere else? I don't know. He just hasn't been good in a while.
No, he avoided 3.6 tackles per 100 attempts last year. That was way the worst in football among heavily used backs. I just don't think he's going to be fantasy relevant anymore at all. Okay, up next, the Panthers have Jonathan Stewart, who will be 31 next year.
Scott, this is your team, so I'm going to give you the floor to discuss Jonathan Stewart. Go.
Okay, so Stewart was one of the trailers of the position in yards after contact per attempt at 2.2 yards last year. At his best, he was kind of a battering ram that could really get a lot of yards after contact. I'm not sure he has that same explosiveness anymore, and because of that, I think the team is probably going to release him. Either that, they could potentially restructure him. He still is a good pass blocker, but given his lack of fantasy relevance on the Panthers in recent seasons, and given that he might not be a great fit for other teams, I just don't see him as being a fantasy asset again in the future.
Yeah, and to your point, the Panthers are kind of middle of the road as far as cap space goes. They don't have a whole heck of a lot, but they could save like $4 million by cutting him. And let's face it, McCaffrey is going to be the future at that position for them. So yeah, I'd agree. I think he's a pretty good candidate to be cut.
Okay, one last NFC team, and that's the Cardinals, who have Adrian Peterson, who'll be 33 next year.
Yeah, I just don't see a role for him on that team. It seems like obviously they're going through a lot of changes this year. New coach, new quarterback. So I don't think I think they just will roll with David Johnson and find some backups either in the draft or free agency. Now, whether he's Adrian Peterson that is still relevant somewhere, who knows? He wasn't really good with his two teams last year. He averaged, I think it was 3 yards a carry with the Saints, and then only 3.5 yards a carry with the Cardinals. So, and look, that was after him having a hard time finding a job in the first place. So, I don't know. I think his days might finally be over.
I agree with you. All right, let's move on to the AFC cut candidates then, and start with the Buffalo Bills, who have Tyrod Taylor at quarterback, who's going to be 29 next year.
Yeah, I mean, I still like Tyrod, but I just, all the signs that the Bills have been giving, whether it was during the season and benching him and how they're positioned for the draft this year and sort of the rumblings about them looking for a quarterback, I think he's gone bursting. And quite honestly, just the lack of faith they had in him when they did re-sign him. I mean, they didn't exactly sign him to a long-term deal. That would cost him a lot of money. So I think he gets cut. Now, whether he can be productive at another team, it really will all revolve around the team he signs with. Hopefully it's a team that utilizes his strengths and doesn't just sign him to be a backup or something. I don't know if he's going to be a starter, but I do think he gets cut.
I'm very confident Taylor's going to get a starting job. I just feel like there's this perception out there that the Bills don't think highly enough of Taylor for his skills. And I think the thing you would point to in particular is that Taylor has been very good at holding onto the ball. He has basically no interceptions and I think has the fewest turnovers of any quarterback in the league by rate. I'm not sure that makes him a great quarterback because I think he's just hyper conservative, but it's going to be enough to get him a job somewhere. I'm not sure that his fantasy value is going to change no matter where he lands. I just feel like he's kind of the player that he's going to be, getting the most of his value through his legs. But I think he's going to get a starting job, so he'll be fantasy relevant going forward. With the Titans, they have DeMarco Murray at running back, who's going to be 30 next year. What do you think about him?
I think he definitely gets cut. I mean, they've got Derrick Henry, who has more than proved that he's capable of it. And again, one of the benefits of having a good young running back is how cheap he is. So they don't need to spend money on DeMarco Murray. Now, do I think DeMarco Murray could be productive somewhere else? Yeah, I think he could. I mean, to me, I know he surprised a lot of people when he went to Tennessee and was actually very productive after coming off that disaster year in Philadelphia. So I think he does end up somewhere. I do think he sees significant action, and I do think he's productive just somewhere else.
I feel like he might be better suited to be a third down back at this point in his career. He actually kind of reminds me of where Matt Forte was when he was going to the Jets, where like his yards after contact per attempt have fallen off steadily from 2.6 yards in 2013 and 14 to 2.2 yards the last in 2015 and 16 to last year to just 2.0 yards. I think he does his best work as a receiving back, and that's probably where he'll fit going forward. And speaking of Matt Forte, the Jets have a decision with him as he enters his age 33 season.
Yeah, and that's one that I don't have as confident an answer on, only because they don't have a ready-made kind of replacement. Like at least with Tennessee, you've got Derrick Henry. That's a no-brainer. But I don't know who would replace Forte there. And look, it's not like they're exactly completely rebuilding. I mean, they brought back Todd Bowles. They have some good young pieces on offense there. So I don't know. It's not as clear-cut to me that they cut Forte. I think he might stay.
They definitely don't have a player like Henry that can step in and get 200-plus touches. But I do think that Elijah McGuire can do what Forte had been doing for the team, in particular as a receiver. Actually, 2017 was the first time in recent seasons that Forte failed to record 10 yards added. And Elijah McGuire actually added 12 yards with just 20 catchable targets this year. I could see him getting all of those Forte catches next year and sort of serving that role in lieu of Forte. So I think the team's going to cut him, but You're right. It's a little uncertain. He's not as expensive as some of these other guys. Okay, up next we have the Ravens. They have Jeremy Maclin, who's going to be 30.
Oh, I wish they would just put him out of his misery. He just wasn't good. I mean, it's really unfortunate because he's been one of my favorite players between the Eagles and then when he went to the Chiefs. I mean, I always felt he was a little more underrated than he deserved. But in Baltimore, it was just a disaster. And given it's not necessarily all his fault. I mean, that whole offense was a disaster this year. So, but I think they definitely cut him and saved the money on him.
Yeah, and actually by yards added, Maclin started to see a dip in his efficiency even as last year with the Chiefs. I just don't feel like he's the same player that he used to be, which means that I don't expect him to have much fantasy relevance again in his future. Okay, probably the most controversial ones, at least maybe this side of Des Bryant. The Broncos have Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas at 31 and 30 years old. Do you think either of them might get cut?
Yeah, if I had to pick one, I'd probably go Manny Sanders only because he is a little older, and I think they would much rather hold on to Demaryius Thomas. But they can, I mean, obviously they can save money by cutting one of them, and I think it would be a good time because they are going to have a new quarterback to bring in a receiver to sort of develop with them. And that could be a receiver already on the roster in Carlos Henderson, or it could be a receiver they draft or somebody else they bring in. But I think it's a very good time to do that. And look, they're pretty tight on money as it is. So I got to imagine that they're going to be looking to save money wherever they can. So to me, I would go with Manny Sanders being cut. And personally, I think he could still be productive. I think, if anything, we've seen receivers change teams quite a bit and still be productive wherever they go. So I would still look for Sanders to be productive.
The concern I have with Sanders is that he had negative 53 yards added last year, which was the worst among all wide receivers. I think that maybe injuries could have been a factor. Obviously, he was in and out of the lineup for most of the year, but I do wonder whether he maybe has seen a decline in skills that may make it difficult for him to get back to even wide receiver 2 status. I'm a little nervous about him, but I'm not totally sure what the Broncos are going to do there. Okay, one last guy in the AFC, and that's for the Raiders, Michael Crabtree, entering age 31 season. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they keep him. I think, the season that Amari Cooper had kind of complicates this, meaning if Cooper had a truly dominant year, this would be a pretty easy decision. But because he didn't, and I don't know if they have many options behind them, I think they keep him. And look, I think Crabtree can still be good, whether it's in Oakland or he goes somewhere else.
The amazing thing to me is that even though Cooper had huge drop issues, he was still a more efficient receiver than Crabtree was this last year. And actually, Crabtree has been the third least efficient receiver in football over the last 2 years, ahead of only Allen Robinson and Mike Evans. So I don't really see Crabtree as still being the player that he was at his peak. So if I were the Raiders, I would let him go. I'm not sure they will, but I wouldn't at all be surprised there. All right, Michael, we've got one more topic to cover in our topic 6. And since the NFL Combine is kicking off next week, it'll probably finish right around when we record our next podcast after this one. So we're going to cover it extensively on that. But for viewers that maybe want to check out the Combine and have opinions about what's happening as it happens, I just thought I'd ask you, Michael, what your thoughts are on it, like what they should be looking for, maybe if there are players that are particularly interesting that you want to watch, anything along those lines that you have.
Well, for me, it's about sort of, I guess, tempering your expectations with that, meaning you're going to have some players that really shine at the Combine and really, pop some eyes, and then some that may have expected to do better but didn't, so it might be a tad disappointing. But either way, I think you have to just take, for me, the Combine along with the whole resume, whether that's college production, whether that's the measurables, and look right on into the situation they eventually get drafted in. All those things, to me, contribute to what a good rookie prospect is.
Yeah, I think that's a great mental approach, Michael. And the other thing I'll say, just specific to the drills in the Combine itself, I feel like there's definitely a mismatch in the perception of which drills are the most important and which really are. I'd actually talked a little earlier about the prospect projection model that I've been working on. And at least with the research that I've been doing, I don't think the 40-yard dash is nearly as important as a predictor as most people think. It is an important predictor for wide receivers and tight ends, but for running backs, I think it's more important to focus on their bench press total and then in particular their 20-yard shuttle time. That shuttle drill is actually a really cool one because it has prospects cutting around cones. So it captures both, a combination of their quick acceleration out of a standstill and then also some lateral quickness. I just think those are more important skills for a running back than just straightaway speed. Kind of on a similar lines there, vertical leaping ability, it's something that they measure. To me, based on the research that I've done, that's only really an important predictor of receiving touchdowns. So, it's awesome when a running back leaps over a defender, when he leaps over the defensive line to score a touchdown, but it's just not really an important tool to help forecast what he's going to be in the future. So I would just kind of pay attention to that, focus on that for the wide receivers, and look for other ways to evaluate running backs. Okay, next up, it's everyone's favorite new segment, Ask Dynasty Dr. Michael.
You'll all get through this. I give you my word as a real doctor.
Ask Dynasty Dr. Michael.
All right, we got a couple of great questions from Twitter this week, Michael, and it actually leads off with a former writer for PFF Fantasy and current writer for Fantasy Pros, Mike Tagliere. He asks, why are people writing off Joe Mixon after 1 year when he was in a three-way timeshare with one of the worst offensive lines and coaching staffs in all of football? And before you answer, I'll mention that Best Ball Junkie had a similar question saying that he, in particular, isn't a huge Mixon fan, but based on what he saw that last year in where he's being drafted in fantasy drafts that he's seeing right now, he's surprised that he's going so low. So, Michael, do you think Mixon is being undervalued right now in mock drafts?
I don't, only because I guess I don't either see it or I don't participate in drafts where he is being undervalued. I think he's going to be a pretty highly valued asset, quite honestly. I mean, I know in our PFF and our consensus rankings, dynasty-wise anyway, he's sort of on that running back 1-2 fringe, which I think is fine. And look, even maybe a little low by the end of it, because to Mike's point, they are letting go of Jeremy Hill. At least that's every indication. So that first and second down role is all Joe Mixon now. He's not going to get the 3-down duty because they do still have Gio Bernard. And look, Gio Bernard, to his credit, was pretty effective last year. But I think, by removing Jeremy Hill and you've removed a big chunk of the equation, it's just going to open things up for Mixon. And look, they drafted Mixon pretty high, even with the baggage that he had. So it's obvious that they're okay with the risk. And I think they're probably ready to sort of turn the keys over. And look, as we sort of discussed a couple weeks ago, it's only been 1 year for Mixon. This is not going to, this doesn't determine the rest of his career. I mean, look at Todd Gurley, who had one down year, but then went right back and became the offensive player of the year, literally. So all it takes is 1 year to turn it around. And I think for Mixon, it's very possible he does that. So to answer your question, I don't know that people are lowballing him, at least not yet. And if they are, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that in dynasty leagues, Mixon is going to keep going high. But I'll mention that even in at least the PFF Fantasy Writers mock draft that we've just concluded, that's a redraft mock, and it's a PPR mock. And Mixon went pretty high as the number 27 overall player at the start of the third round. That was just after backs like Kenyon Drake, LeSean McCoy, and Devontae Freeman, and ahead of Christian McCaffrey, Dion Lewis, Carlos Hyde, and Mark Ingram. It is important to note that that's a PPR mock. I think that's fair, but I actually see Mixon probably getting in the 40 to 50 catch range this season. I kind of see him as similar to what DeMarco Murray was earlier in his Tennessee career, where maybe not just having the first and second down work, maybe he's just going to be on for 3 offensive possessions and then off for 1, that kind of trade-off with Bernard, because I think both of them are kind of versatile players. I think Tagliere, though, was right about the offensive line play. Mixon had horrible yards before contact numbers, but wasn't too bad with the 2.4 yards after contact per attempt. And he is a good blocker and receiver. So I think he has a future as a 3-down back. Not sure it starts this year, but I expect him to go higher in drafts overall than maybe Mike and Best Ball Junkie have been seeing so far this offseason.
Well, and let's not forget, he's 21. He's going to be entering his age 22 season. He's literally going to be younger than some of the rookie running backs coming in, and he's already got a year under his belt. So, yeah, I think it's much too early to sell from that.
All right, next up we have a question from Jason Gomez, who asks, who should he keep, Dalvin Cook or Carlos Hyde? He already has LeSean McCoy as a definite keeper, and he's afraid that Hyde might end up in a bad spot, and that that Dalvin Cook, he lost his offensive coordinator, and Latavius Murray was pretty good this year. So I think he's worried that Cook isn't the slam dunk that maybe some others think he is. Which player would you go with?
Yeah, I do think he is the slam dunk.
I actually agree.
Yeah, I mean, look, and given it wasn't a big sample size with Cook, it was only a month, but in that month, I mean, look, he saw 20 touches plus in every single game, and he could handle the 3-down back role. He just could. And he did tear the ACL, but the silver lining in that is I think he did it early enough last season to where he'll be ready for the upcoming season. But you've got Jerick McKinnon, who's a free agent, probably not coming back. He's got Latavius Murray, who is quite a bit older than Cook is. So it's very possible Murray is sort of the, kind of the guy to spell Cook. But no, I think long-term, especially over a guy like Hyde, who sees some uncertainty being a free agent. We don't know where he's going to land. And I think Cook just has a very good situation. And look, he's on an ascending offense. I mean, all the pieces to that offense are coming back. No matter which quarterback they bring back, I think Cook will probably do well with that. So to me, it's not even very close. I would keep Cook over Hyde.
I agree with you. I'm very confident that Cook is going to be a 3-down back. And I think with Hyde, even though he was a 3-down back this last year, I think he was kind of miscast in that role. And the evidence I have is that he had negative 53 yards added on his catchable targets last year. That was the worst among all running backs. I feel like he might be better served having maybe 15 to 20 catches a year instead of the 59 that he had. And if that transition happens the way I expect, I think he becomes really more of a flex running back and less of a running back one kind of guy. So I'm not excited about keeping Hyde, and if I have a choice between Cook and Hyde, I'm definitely going with Cook. All right, Michael, one more section to go. That's the gunpoint banner.
Guys.
Gunpoint banter.
All right, Michael, we've been talking a little bit about that PFF Fantasy Writers mock PPR draft that we have been working on the last couple of weeks. And I think there was a really cool thing that happened with our two teams that I think would make a good question for this. And so it starts with that you drafted Greg Olsen at tight end as the number 59 player overall. That made him the number 5 tight end off the board behind Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and or maybe it's just the 4. But then 2.5 rounds later, I took Jordan Reed, number 91 overall, and that was also behind Evan Ingram, Jimmy Graham, and Hunter Henry. So, Michael, kind of breaking that down, who would you rather have? Would you rather have Olsen at the end of the 5th round or Jordan Reed in the middle of the 8th round?
I would still take, if those are the rounds we're working with, I would still take Olsen in the 5th. Yes, he's sort of coming off an injury-filled season last year, which was really his first season like that. He doesn't have a prior history of real significant injuries. And look, he did show flashes of returning to the productive tight end we know him as. I mean, he had a pretty good game against the Saints. He went up for over 100 there. For me, with Reed, it's just the injuries. That's what it comes down to. And look, I understand in theory taking Reed later in drafts and even taking him as possibly, a very high-end backup. But if we're talking the 8th round for a guy like Reed, to me, that's still too high. I'm extremely concerned about the injury history. He has yet to play a full 16 games. The most he's played is 14, and that was once. And before that, the highest was 12. So unless Reed, to me, can turn in a full, 15 to 16 game season, I'm very, very hesitant to draft him that high.
Yeah, Reed's injury history is definitely scary. In particular, the fact that he's had 6 concussions. So that's definitely horrible. But I will point out that last year, even though we only played in 6 games, the real issue for him was a hamstring injury, something that I think he'll probably be overcoming over the offseason. And if you break down Reed and Olsen's fantasy production by game, it actually tilts a little bit more in Reed's favor. The two are very similar in both targets per game and yards per game, but Reed has scored about twice as many touchdowns per game, 0.61 versus 0.30. So in the games that they do play together, Reed has been the more effective player. Injuries, though, I mean, you're right. I mean, Reed has played 10 fewer games the last 3 years than Greg Olsen, even though Olsen missed a lot of 2017 with that broken foot. I guess my question for you is, looking into next season when Olsen's going to be 34 years old compared to just 28 for Reed, like how many more games would you project for Olsen to play than Reed, just kind of taking all possibilities into account?
Well, I think with Olsen, like I said, last year was sort of an outlier, at least up to this point. And yes, he's getting older, but he's got a whole offseason to recover. I'm still looking for Olsen to do a 14 to 16 game season. I don't think there's anything to indicate that he would do otherwise. With Reed, again, I mean, literally the most he's played is 14, and it's more common that he played closer to 10 or 12. So for me, I would project Reed in the 10 to 12 range and Olsen in the 14 to 16 range. So that's still going to be at least 2 games, maybe even 4 difference that I see between the two, which to me justifies picking or a bigger difference in the rounds they take than just 3.
All right, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Dynasty Slant. Thanks everybody that's been listening, and I encourage you to subscribe if you aren't already. We're part of the PFF Fantasy Specialty podcasts that also include our IDP and DFS shows, and Michael and I are going to continue to do these every couple of weeks or so throughout the rest of the offseason. Next up will be our look at the Combine after that happens, so definitely come back and look for us next week. But again, thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks.